Introducing Punch Bowl News. From Anna Palmer, Jake Sherman, and John Bresnik. News about the people who matter, for the people who matter. Join the community at punchbowl.news.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Roost and joining us on the live stream. My name is Anna Palmer. I'm CEO and one of the founders of Punch Bowl News. I want to thank you for joining me to kick off our 2022 series, Investing in America. A big thank you to our partner for this event, American Investment Council. This morning, I'm going to be sitting down with Senator Bill Hagerty, a Republican from Tennessee, to discuss the role of private capital in investing in small businesses and communities coming out of the pandemic. Afterward, Drew Maloney, CEO of the American Investment Council, and Mark Blumling, CEO, founder, and board member of Headlands Research, is going to join me for a fireside chat. As always, just a quick reminder, we are on all social media platforms at Punch Bowl News, so please share about the conversation if you are so inclined. And with that, I'd like to welcome Senator Hagerty to the stage. Senator. All right. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you.
Perfect. You're going to be in the middle seat here. All right. Well, we're very excited to have you here today. As always, Washington has lots happening. No shortage of things to discuss.
And it's St. Patrick's Day. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Happy St. Patrick's. I appreciate the tie. I'm wearing green. My husband is here somewhere, who's Irish Catholic, so we celebrate this as a high holiday in our family.
Got it.
All right. We're going to do a couple news of the day questions, and then we're going to get to the topic of small businesses, investing, private equity. But couldn't start this conversation without kind of framing it around Ukraine, what's happening on the global stage right now. We reported this morning in Punch Bowl News AM that Democrats are trying to figure out what to do when it comes to gas prices. There's a lot of different proposals out there. Should there be a tax holiday? Should there be other kind of ways around trying to get money in the hands of Americans? LA, I think gas is $6 a gallon right now.
Yeah, I was just in California last weekend. It's there.
What is there anything you would support or do you think would work when it comes to this that you might be able to work with Democrats on?
Absolutely. And Senator Hawley and I have a bill out that will actually address this. And it's essentially reversing all of the policies that Biden started the day he came into office, the war on the oil and gas industry. It's very myopic, very short-sighted. None of us are against alternative fuel sources, but the pace and the speed and the vigor with which they've attacked the oil and gas industry here in America is very, very disturbing. What's happened? The day that Joe Biden came into office, he killed the Keystone XL pipeline. He halted drilling on federal lands and offshore. ANWR is now shut off. And essentially the message that's been sent to the markets, and we've got a lot of people here that understand the markets, is that you shouldn't invest in this sector. The government's not going to support it. Capital is not going to be drawn to this sector. And we've had, the result has been a lack of supply. A supply and demand shortfall has created, massive price increases well before the Ukraine situation took place. It's been exacerbated by Ukraine, but that's what started this off. If we would send a loud message, a strong message to the global marketplace now, that we're going to get back into the business of becoming energy independent again, we'd put ourselves in a position where we could actually export natural gas, which is much cleaner than anything coming out of Russia.
What about a gas tax holiday? I mean, that's a big proposal that you're talking about. I can't imagine a lot of Democrats are going to work on that. But gas tax holiday in the specific, would you be supportive of that?
Well, it's not a big proposal. It's actually a very, very logical proposal to just go back to what was working. Because when I was U.S. ambassador to Japan, I was actually working with the Japanese. I convinced them to invest billions of dollars of capital in LNG infrastructure so they could become importers of our energy. That's good for them from an economic standpoint, but from a strategic standpoint, too. I asked them, what is the strategic value of bringing your energy in from Russia, from Qatar, when you could be working with us? So there's a strong national security element of this as well. With respect to a gas tax holiday or these other gimmicks that they're talking about, what it tells me is that the Democrats are looking at the same poll numbers that I am. And the number one issue on voters' minds right now is inflation and gas prices. And they're trying to come up with a short-term fix. This is nothing more than a gimmick. This is not a long-term path to our independence from an energy perspective.
I want to ask, you have called for a classified briefing after the debacle over whether the U.S. or Poland would be willing to transfer fighter jets to Ukraine. Have you gotten any more clarity on what happened between the U.S. and Poland and, what might happen going into the future?
We're still in the process of getting this briefing scheduled. Things move slower in Washington than they do in the private sector, I must say. But it was very concerning to me to see our Secretary of State greenlight the transfer of the MiGs, and then the next day the Pentagon walked that down. Look, President Zelensky spoke to us yesterday. He spoke to us a couple of weeks before. He's a very compelling figure. He's done a great job of reaching to the emotional component of all of this. And I think if you look at it, one, he's inspired the people of Ukraine. That's important. That's his job. But two, the whole world has been locked down for a couple of years. We've been deprived of our own liberty and freedom. And when we see a person like Zelensky in a nation like Ukraine stand up and fight for liberty and freedom, that's really grasping the heartstrings of everyone. And so there's an emotional component of this that makes everybody want to do something, to step up and engage. But my job as U.S. Senator for the people of Tennessee and for this nation is to not react to emotional things, but to be collected, calm, and do what I think is best for the nation, what's best for America. Clearly, Zelensky's trying to do what's best for Ukraine. He's putting Ukraine's interests first. My job is to put America's interests first and understand the complexities of what we're talking about. This is not simple.
Right. And when you talk about that, certainly he has been a very compelling figure. Are you more open to a humanitarian no-fly zone or finding a way to get Ukraine more advanced weapons after hearing from him this week?
I'm not open to a no-fly zone at this point. That engages us in a much different way. I mean, we're talking about putting, American servicemen and women on the front line here and engaging in a way with a nuclear power, engaging in a very escalated manner. I'm having a hard time with this too about how we prioritize things, because we're sending over billions of aid to Ukraine right now to help them defend their borders, yet we won't defend our own southern border. My home state of Tennessee has seen more deaths and more overdoses from fentanyl every month is worse than the month before since January of last year. Why is that? Because the southern borders collapsed. Fentanyl's coming in from China. The cartels are moving it across the borders, and they're killing Americans right now. And this administration will do nothing about it.
Let's shift to the reason we are here today to talk about small business and investments coming out of the pandemic. You started your own business in private equity. You've dealt with economic development issues at the state and federal level, so you know this topic very well.
Yeah.
A lot of small businesses have struggled throughout the pandemic. One area we've seen a lot of investment has been through the private equity industry, particularly Tennessee. A number that I saw was $10 billion of capital delivered. Can you talk about what investments like that mean for your home state?
Capital investment is absolutely critical. You mentioned that I worked in this arena in economic development in my home state. I was the Commerce Secretary for Tennessee, the Chief of Economic Development for my state. And I came in at a time, Anna, when we were working through the last recession. Tennessee's numbers were not good. We arrived in January of 2011, and we arrived at a situation where Tennessee's unemployment numbers were higher than the national average. Our GDP growth, our wage growth was lower than the national average. We had a lot of people that were unemployed and hurting. And it was important to really turn that around and focus on making our state as attractive as we possibly could for capital investment. We have a great location. That's a God-given benefit. So that helped a great deal. But putting in place business-friendly regulations and tax policy made our state attractive, and then getting out and working and selling. So our state turned around in the 4 years I served in that role. By the time I left, we'd become the #1 state in the nation for economic development 2 years in a row. Oh. And we were the #1 state in America for creating jobs through capital investment. Capital investment begets jobs. Jobs creates economic opportunity for everybody. It's a positive, virtuous cycle. And that economic opportunity solves so many social ills.
Congress passed the American Rescue Plan. There's been talk from Democrats that maybe more money is needed to help small businesses. Are there areas that you think Congress needs to act, or do you think it's more of the private sector kind of restarting their engines on this?
Well, the private sector is certainly a far more efficient actor. I can tell you that from spending my life in the private sector and then working both in the executive branch and now in the legislative branch. There are certainly sectors of our economy that are still hurting. And there are also large amounts of money that has already been committed to pandemic relief, to help the economy, that have not been dispersed, that have not been committed. Again, this is back to the bureaucratic morass that exists here in Washington. I've asked for a complete accounting of where we are on the $6 trillion worth of money that has already been committed by this Congress. We need to understand that first. Again, back to acting responsibly and in a cool-headed manner. We need to know what we haven't deployed, what's not been spent yet, before we start committing more capital and looking for headlines.
So it sounds like probably not for more money, more of an accounting and kind of figure out if there's money that's already been allocated that should be spent.
Yeah, my sense is if there is money that hasn't been allocated that could be put to a better use, as a responsible steward of taxpayer money, that's the way I should be approaching it, rather than just allocating yet more money again. That's a more responsible manner of addressing it. I'm not saying that everything is fixed and that there's not more to do, particularly in certain sectors. Where I'm from in Tennessee, entertainment is a huge industry, and the entertainment industry has been hammered.
Right.
So you think about sectors like entertainment, restaurants, things of that nature that have really been hit hard. Other sectors have actually boomed. And that's happened in my state too. We're a big logistics state. And if you think about, the business that the direct delivery, phenomena that has arisen through the pandemic, a lot of that happens in Tennessee and has benefited us. But again, sector by sector, there's a very different result.
To talk, last night, Jay Powell was voted 23-1 out of the Senate banking panel for another term at the Federal Reserve. Leo Brainerd was also cleared on a bipartisan manner. How important do you think it is that Powell and others get into place, especially considering inflation and so many other critical things that could hurt the economy?
What we need right now is continuity and certainty as they try to address this market. The Fed is behind the curve. They've got a big challenge ahead of themselves because, I'd argued last year that they needed to curtail the balance sheet expansion. I still believe that was the correct move, but they've, finally are in a position now where they're beginning to raise rates. I think they could have begun much sooner. They're going to have to thread this needle very, very carefully. Is it possible? Yes, but it's going to take a very careful hand, and having continuity, I think, is going to be helpful there.
When you talk about that, so I think the Fed raised rates by 0.25%, I believe, yesterday, for the first time in 4 years. How far do you think the Fed could go? Are you concerned that we are headed, or are we already in a recession?
I'm very concerned about the possibility for a recession. Nobody wants to see that, but the conditions are very challenging right now in the marketplace. The employment market has been distorted greatly by all the stimulus funds that were injected into the marketplace. We essentially subsidized unemployment over the course of this past year and a half, 2 years. We've got to get ourselves back to a more normal state. I'm very optimistic that we're putting the pandemic in our rearview mirror. That's always been a critical overhang here. But as we come out of this, I think that the Fed is going to have to be very, very careful about global issues. The situation between Ukraine and Russia is weighing heavily on the marketplace, but we also have to take into account the incentives that are in place right here in America. I hope that more Americans are drawn back into the marketplace, and that this process is gradual, that we see a reduction in inflation. Again, I think some of the policy options before us, if we would just get back into becoming a domestic provider of energy, we could solve a lot of this.
I want to ask you on another agency front, the SEC. They've taken a much more aggressive regulatory posture when it comes to private equity and a host of other industries right now. Do you think the Biden administration is overreaching here?
Without question. What we've seen in the public markets is, regulatory overreach in the public markets, which has pushed more and more capital and more companies to be, privately funded rather than utilize the public markets, because the cost, the overhang is so great being in the public arena. I know Drew Maloney will be here to talk about this, and he's very articulate on these issues in just a few moments. But the notion is that now, in order to address that fact, that regulatory overhang and cost, compliance cost, have pushed companies into the private sector, now we're going to go in and make the private sector just as non-competitive as we did the public sector, because we're going to regulate them the same way that we did the public markets. Where's the capital going to go next? Overseas? I mean, I don't think this is a good thing for America.
And what can Congress do when it comes to that? Is it working with the SEC, or is it bringing them up and having them testify?
Well, there's something called the Congressional Review Act,
right.
And these rules that they're going to put forward, I'm going to use the Congressional Review Act to its fullest extent. Again, I'm very sensitive to anything that makes it more difficult to deploy capital here in America. If we're not the most attractive place to deploy capital, we become less competitive as a nation. This notion that we're going to come in and regulate accredited investors, sophisticated investors. They're not taking away the requirement that one be an accredited investor to invest in these private vehicles. They're going to require pension funds who have complete capability of doing their due diligence to somehow, deal with all of this regulatory morass in the private sector, see lower returns, And again, I think it's going to push capital offshore.
We are quickly running out of time, but I have two questions for you. One, I want to talk to you about a priority that you have. You championed a bill that would add technologies impacting national security to sectors that can utilize the FAST 41 improved federal permitting program, passed 100 to 0. Talk to us about why that's so important and then kind of where that issue stands right now.
Well, and I think we're all aware of the fact that there's a chip shortage here in America. It's affecting most things you want to buy. If you try to buy a car, you go to order an appliance, everybody's probably been through this experience. It's going to be 4 months. It's going to be 6 months. It took me 7 months to get a car just recently. The chip shortage is impacting supply chains throughout our nation. When I came into office, I did what a business person would do. I started calling leaders of chip manufacturing companies around the world and asking them what was standing in the way of them investing here in America in their chip capacity. And they all gave me a variety of reasons. Some of them came to visit me in person to talk with me about this. But every one of them mentioned one thing, and that was the fact that it takes roughly 5 years to permit a chip fab facility. Look, these are multi-billion-dollar investments. They use a lot of energy. They use a lot of water. There's a lot of environmental permitting that's required to get this done. And the FAST 41 was an idea that made a great deal of sense to me. It's a fast-track process that forces the bureaucracy here to work more rapidly, meaning they've got to parallel process the permitting rather than do it in series. Sounds simple enough. The bureaucracy doesn't like it because they have to work harder, and sometimes there may be a box that hasn't been checked and they've got to go back and rework it. But with this legislation, we're going to take the timeline from 5 years. And you think about it from the standpoint of a chip manufacturing firm. 5-year timeline to get permitted. The rate of technology development in that industry means that by the time you're permitted, you're obsolete. This takes it down to about 18 months. That makes us competitive as a nation. Does it solve the problem short term, Anna? No, but in the medium and long term, this is the path to become more competitive as a nation. This is why you elect people like me to come to the Congress, and it didn't get any publicity because it's not controversial. But these are precisely the types of things that we need to be looking for to try to help improve our economy, make us more competitive as a nation.
We've been reporting for the past several months on it's been called a lot of things from USICA to chips to, I don't know, I think we're on our 5th name now. What are you hearing in terms of timeline? I know that's a big priority for a lot of Republicans, Democrats to get it done potentially by Memorial Day. Do you think that's realistic?
It certainly is realistic. The process is beginning right now to make that happen. But the bill that came back from the House was far different from what the Senate sent over. Right. And I think the Senate's been pretty clear in their messaging that in conference this is going to have to come back to something much closer to what it was originally.
All right, last question. We're in a midterm year. 50-50 Senate, longer than it's been in decades. What are the odds? What are your odds that Mitch McConnell is majority leader after the election?
The odds are extremely high that he'll be the majority leader. Again, I mentioned the polling data earlier, but if you look at the generic ballot in the battleground states across America, Republicans are up not just 1 or 2 points, 6 points, 7 points, 9 points. There's a significant advantage right now. I think that the American public are going to vote about the policies that this administration has put forward. They're looking at the economy. They're looking at inflation. They're looking at the miserable performance in Afghanistan. They're still embarrassed about that. They're looking at what's happening around the world right now and our posture in the world. And I think they're going to vote Republican in a very big way in the United States Senate and in the House.
All right. Well, we shall see come November.
Thanks,
Thank
Anna.
you so much, Senator.
Good
Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be
All right. Thanks a lot. Take care. All right, now I'd like to welcome Drew Maloney, American Investment Council CEO, and Mark Blumling, CEO and founder and board member of Headlands Research, to join me on stage for a chat. Hi. Thanks so much for coming here. Thank you. All right, well, a lot to follow up on in that interesting conversation with the senator. I know most people watching online and in here probably know American Investment Council, but Drew, give us the kind of 30-second landscape of what it is that you all do if they are unfamiliar.
Great. Thanks, Anna, for having us today. The American Investment Council is the largest education, advocacy, and research arm for private equity and private credit here in Washington, D.C. We support more than 30,000 businesses. A majority of those are small businesses in every state and almost every community across America.
So let's follow up on that, because we're here to talk about small business, private equity. That's not always the two words that you come together to talk about where people think about necessarily. What is industry doing to help invest in small business? I know you have a lot of kind of money that you've been deploying, particularly during the pandemic.
Right. No, it's a great point. And a lot of people don't realize the amount of capital that private equity puts into small business. Last year alone, we invested in more than 5,000 small businesses across the country. And if you think about it, you know, an entrepreneur comes up with an idea, whether it's Anna and Jake, you at Punchbowl, it's Axios, it's Politico, it's Market Headlands, has this great idea and is an entrepreneur and wants to build it, but they need capital to grow. And as Mark will tell you, he started with just an idea, just one employee, and he built his company to 400 using private equity capital and partnership to do that. And we're doing that at thousands of companies every year across the country.
Mark, I want to bring you into this conversation. Thanks for joining us from California. Talk about Headlands, for those who aren't familiar with it, what you're doing, how the business has grown from one to, and now you've scaled to many different cities.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me. So Headlands is a clinical research site organization. So we're the groups that actually do the testing for all pharmaceutical trials. We did all the COVID vaccines. And our focus really is to help move therapeutics along that get approved. And so we, again, as Drew mentioned, we started with one person. We now have 15 sites throughout the U.S. and Canada, and we continue to grow. And private equity has been really instrumental in that. We wouldn't have been able to do it otherwise.
Talk about that. So, you know, you said the benefit is growth. It's the ability to kind of get into different markets. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Sure. So we can approach it from two perspectives. One, we partner and bring in through acquisition other clinical trial sites that have been doing it for tens of years. We have one site we brought in that's been over 45 years within the clinical trial space. But we also start de novos. We have a strong focus on diversity populations for clinical trials. We think it's really important. It's been important for us from day one we were founded. And so we'll literally start sites in areas that don't have clinical trials. And currently 5% of the population that could participate does. And so we're hoping to increase that for the benefit of anyone from a therapeutic perspective as we move forward.
Drew, I want to go to you. AIC recently put out a report in advance of President Joe Biden's State of the Union address about kind of how the industry has invested more than $1 trillion in communities. Walk us through that a little bit.
You know, if you look at the footprint of private equity across the country, we have more than 11 million employees that we support. We have more than 30,000 businesses. Last year alone, 74% of our investments went to companies of 500 or smaller employees, and nearly a third had 10 or less employees. And, you know, the other thing that often gets overlooked is the investment dollars are returned to pension fund retirees throughout the country, and we have some of the best returns for pensioners every year across the country.
Mark, when you talk about just kind of going into different communities, and you certainly have grown from the California where you started to Portland to other areas, what's the economic benefit that you've seen in some of these communities as you go in as a small business provider, hiring folks, things along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing we do is when we come into a new population, let's say, or one of our de novo sites, the key part of us is always about people. It's bringing the great people in to do the great work that we need to do. So it's bringing or training people. In many cases, when we do the de novos, they may not have had clinical trial experience, so we will train them over 4 to 6 months, make sure that they have the knowledge and expertise to move forward. So when we go into a community, it's about adding skill sets, adding experience, and I think enhancing the community and the quality of work we're doing. It also adds jobs, which is really important. And in many of the communities we look at particularly we have sites along the border in Texas and other areas, it's really important for development because there aren't as many opportunities as you might have here in Washington, D.C. and other places.
So we're obviously in Washington. Would be interested in your take and yours, Drew. Just we're coming out of the pandemic. I think the senator said hopefully it's in the rearview mirror. But how did the pandemic, impact your business, impact how you thought about things in terms of planning? I think sometimes we can often get into the very 100,000-foot level here in Washington, but I think it's always good to hear a personal story as well.
I mean, so a great thing that we did is we touched all the vaccines that have been out there that have been approved. And so from a personnel do well, do good perspective, it's something we really appreciate on a personal level. So it's been a really hectic time the last 2 years. We had over 5,000-6,000 trial participants within the COVID trials alone across our sites. And so it's been kind of nonstop frenetic activity. I would say, COVID vaccine work and other kind of treatments are still continuing. There'll be combination trials moving forward. So we'd like to put it behind the rearview mirror, but there are also pharmaceutical companies preparing for what may lie ahead. And again, best laid plans. Hopefully we won't have to use them, but but it's wise to think ahead.
Absolutely. Drew, can you talk about that just in terms of the investment strategy, in terms of how the private equity firms have been supporting, small businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think the beauty about private equity and many of these portfolio companies, like Mark was talking about headlines, like he didn't shed any jobs during this pandemic. And I think it's that partnership because it's long-term capital, and we're thinking of not the next quarter, but we're thinking 2, 3, 4, 5 years out. So we work with all of our investments and our companies to figure out how to get through these time periods. And if you look at last year, there was more money invested last year in these companies than any other year in the past decade.
Wow. I want to switch to politics. So these are going to be for you, Drew.
Oh.
Just want to get your reaction to Jay Powell, his kind of ongoing, confirmation now. What that means for kind of the markets and private equity as an industry.
Well, as we all know, markets love certainty. So I think, that now that Jay is confirmed as the chair of the Fed, the markets will like that. Look, he's got a lot of challenges ahead. The inflationary time period, as a lot of people believe, is going to last longer than we all hoped, and he's going to have to monitor that closely. And they did their first rate hike. I expect there'll be more rate hikes.
Right.
And, but I think it's still going to be incumbent upon us in private capital to deploy that capital to companies that need it and to continue to help them grow through this time period.
You heard the senators speak a little bit about the SEC,
Right.
Which has its eyes trained on the private equity industry.
Right.
What's your reaction to that, and what you think the implications might be?
Well, I think, as we've talked about, these companies like Mark's, other companies in the Washington area, and these small businesses, the small businesses and the entrepreneurs are really the backbone of the American economy. And I think the last thing you want to do is throw a wet blanket of regulation over that. It's working. So, only in Washington do you have a solution in search of a problem. And I think that's where we are right now. As Senator Hagerty just said, as he was rebuilding the economic engine in Tennessee, if you have the right economic environment, companies will come, they will grow, they will flourish. And I think that's our point right now, is that let us keep growing, let us keep investing in entrepreneurs like Mark. There are thousands of those every year, and it's just unnecessary to add new burdensome regulations, especially at this time where we're trying to get supply chains addressed, technologies out, and I think we have a critical role, and I think we should be looked at as a partner with the government and others to try to solve many of these challenges that we face.
All right, last question. I always try to leave here on a positive note. Do the outlook, 2022. What are you most looking forward to? What should we be knowing kind of as you forecast forward?
Well, I think what we're going to see is continued investment, continued partnering with companies going forward. And I think a lot of it's going to depend on, where we are with inflation in the broader market and the public markets. But I think you will see the private markets continue because they do have that long-term capital view. And as long as the regulatory environment stays in place, I think that we will continue to flourish.
All right. On that note, Mark, Drew, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Thank all of you for joining us for our first in-person, we're very excited, for 2022 editorial event, and for joining us on the live stream as well. I just want to also note, as we announced this morning, we have a very big event that we're excited about with Senator Mitch McConnell on March 31st at 9 a.m. You can go to our events hub at punchbowl.news and register for that as well. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe. Have a great day.